The day my daughter-in-law called me a financial burden in front of her entire book club, I smiled, said nothing, and drove home to my little rental apartment. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat by the window, and thought, she has no idea. I had been keeping a secret for almost 11 years. Not out of shame, not out of fear. I kept it because I had learned the hard way that the moment people find out how much money you have, they stop seeing you. I'd watched it happen to my own mother after my father passed and left her the house and the investment accounts. Suddenly, her phone was ringing. Suddenly, cousins she hadn't spoken to in decades were stopping by with casseroles. I swore I would never let that happen to me, so I kept quiet. I drove a 2014 Honda Civic with a small dent above the rear left wheel well. I shopped at Aldi and TJ Maxx. I wore the same winter coat for 6 years, and every month I watched my investment portfolio grow in a way that would have made my daughter-in-law's jaw hit the floor if she had ever thought to ask. She never asked. My name is June, and I am 53 years old. For the past 22 years, I worked as a senior actuary at a mid-sized insurance firm in Columbus, Ohio. I don't say that to brag. Most people don't even know what an actuary does, which is fine by me. We calculate risk. We look at numbers other people find boring, and we find stories inside them. I was very good at my job. By the time I took early retirement at 51, I was earning just under $310,000 a year, and I had been maxing out my 401(k) and a separate brokerage account since I was 32. I had also paid off my mortgage in 2019, but none of that mattered to my daughter-in-law, Adrienne Colwell, because she had never asked about any of it. What she had decided, the very first time she met me, I think, was that I was a woman of modest means, modest ambitions, and modest value. She'd made that assessment based on my coat and my car, and the fact that I brought a store-brand peach cobbler to their housewarming party, instead of something from the expensive bakery she liked downtown. I had met Adrienne at my son's side. My son Daniel was 30 at the time, working in sales for a software company. He'd met Adrienne at a rooftop bar in Columbus 2 years earlier, and by the time he introduced her to me, she was already talking about the neighborhood they were going to buy in, the schools their future children would attend, the vacations they had planned. She was 28, bright, and the most socially confident person I had ever met. She walked into rooms like she had already won whatever competition was happening inside them. I liked her, actually, in the beginning. I admired the confidence. I thought she and Daniel balanced each other well. He's always been a bit of a dreamer, a little scattered, and she was focused in a way that seemed good for him. I thought we would be fine. It started small, the way she would glance at my car when I pulled up to their house. A comment once about how frugal I was, said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She started calling me Practical June, like it was a term of endearment when it wasn't. When Daniel mentioned once that I had worked in finance, she had laughed and said, "Oh, like bookkeeping." I said, "Close enough," and let it go. I let a lot of things go. Then they bought their house. It was a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in Upper Arlington, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are edged with surgical precision and every car in the driveway is less than 3 years old. I was happy for them. I really was. I went to the housewarming, brought the peach cobbler, admired every room, told Adrienne the kitchen was stunning because it was. She had good taste, I'll give her that. What I didn't expect was that owning the house would shift something in her, like the mortgage had given her a kind of authority that extended beyond the property line. She started making decisions about family gatherings without consulting me. Thanksgiving was moved to her parents' house in Westerville because it's bigger and more central, even though I had hosted Thanksgiving for Daniel every year since his father and I divorced. Christmas became just immediate family, which somehow included her sister and brother-in-law and their 3 kids, but not me. I was invited to Christmas afternoon after the presents for dessert and games. I smiled and brought a nice bottle of wine and stayed for 2 hours. I cried on the drive home. I'm not too proud to admit that. But the thing that finally broke something open in me happened on a Tuesday evening in March, about 8 months after they'd moved in. I had been invited by Daniel, specifically by text, to come for dinner. He'd said Adrian was hosting her book club and that he wanted me there to balance it out a little. I should have read the subtext. I didn't. I arrived at 6:30 with a lemon pound cake, which I had made from scratch, and a good Riesling. Adrian's book club was in full swing in the living room. 6 women, very put together, wine glasses in hand. I said hello, was introduced, sat in the corner chair Daniel pointed me toward. He got me a glass of wine, and then disappeared into the kitchen to check on something, and I was left there in the corner with 6 strangers who were mid-conversation about a book I hadn't read. I tried to be pleasant. I smiled. I listened. I laughed at the right moments. And then one of Adrian's friends, a woman named Cynthia, who had on a blazer that I recognized from the Neiman Marcus catalog, said something about the cost of their ski condo in Breckenridge. And Adrian laughed and said, "Well, not all of us can afford Breckenridge." She was looking at me when she said it. There was a half-second of silence. "June lives very simply," Adrian said, still smiling, "which is admirable. Not everyone needs a lot, right? Some people are just content with basics." Cynthia looked at me with a kind of polite pity that I hadn't felt since I was a 22-year-old intern eating a gas station sandwich at my desk. The other women shifted in their seats. Someone changed the subject. I finished my wine. I said my goodbyes. I drove home, and sitting at my kitchen table that night, I made a decision, not a rash one. I am an actuary. I don't make rash decisions. I looked at the situation from every angle, calculated the risk, weighed the outcomes, and decided very calmly that it was time for me to stop being invisible. But I wasn't going to do it by confronting Adrian. I wasn't going to make a scene or send a letter or have a tearful conversation with Daniel where I complained about his wife. That wasn't my style, and it wasn't going to change anything. I was going to do something much simpler. I was going to buy a house. There was a property for sale 2 streets over from Daniel and Adrian's, a corner lot, brick exterior, a mature oak in the front yard that I had admired every time I drove past. It had been on the market for 6 weeks, which in Upper Arlington typically meant something was wrong with it, but I had looked it up online, and as far as I could tell, the issue was cosmetic. Dated kitchen, ugly carpet throughout, 1 bathroom that needed to be gutted. Things I could fix. The asking price was $600,000. I called my financial advisor, a patient man named Howard Bellamy, who had been managing part of my portfolio for 9 years, and told him what I wanted to do. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "June, are you sure this isn't? Is there an emotional element here?" I told him there might be. He told me the numbers worked. I put in a cash offer the following week. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't buying the house to be close to Daniel and Adrian in some possessive or controlling way. I genuinely loved that neighborhood. I'd always loved it, since before Daniel had ever moved there. I had looked at properties in Upper Arlington years before he met Adrian. This was something I had wanted for myself, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. But I will be honest. I did not hate the timing. I closed on the house in early May. I hired a contractor named Walt Fremont, who had done a bathroom remodel for my colleague's sister, and came with glowing reviews. I picked out new hardwood for the main floor and a tile for the kitchen that was a shade of sage green I had been thinking about for years. I let myself spend a little money. Not recklessly. I never spend recklessly, but thoughtfully, intentionally, the way you do when you've been patient for a very long time. I did not tell Daniel or Adrian, not because I was hiding it from them, but because genuinely neither of them had shown much interest in my life in quite some time. Adrian hadn't asked me a personal question, not a real one, in over a year. Daniel called every week or two, but our conversations were mostly about his work, his home projects, updates on the dog they'd just adopted. That was fine. I wasn't bitter about it. But it did mean that a month passed, and then 2 months, and then 3, and at no point did either of them know that I was overseeing a full renovation 2 streets away. The work took about 4 months. Walt was reliable, which is rarer than it sounds. By September, the house was done. It was, if I'm allowed to say this, about something I worked on, beautiful. The kitchen had clean white cabinets and that sage tile and new appliances that I had researched for probably longer than necessary. The living room had oak floors and a gas fireplace and a built-in bookcase that a carpenter named Pete Drummond had custom-made to my specifications. The master bath had a freestanding tub that I had seen in a magazine and quietly wanted for about 15 years. There was a back porch with a ceiling fan and a string of lights and enough room for the reading chair and small table I'd had in my apartment. I moved in on a Saturday in late September. I hired movers. I unpacked slowly over a week because I wanted to enjoy it. 2 weeks later, I had a housewarming. I invited 12 people, colleagues, old friends, my neighbor from my apartment building, who had become a genuine friend over the years, a retired librarian named Dorothea Wills who wore enormous earrings and brought homemade bread to every occasion. I invited Howard Bellamy and his wife. I did not invite Daniel and Adrian. Not intentionally as an exclusion. I just told Daniel afterward that I'd had a few people over to see the new place, and he said, "Wait, what new place?" And that was when I told him I'd bought a house. There was a long pause. "In Upper Arlington," he said. "Yes," I said. "2 streets over from you." Another pause. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" I said gently that it had never come up. He said that wasn't fair, and I said I supposed not. And I invited him and Adrian to come see it the following Sunday. They came at 2 o'clock. I had made coffee and put out a tray of pastries I'd picked up from a bakery downtown. The expensive one Adrian liked, actually, though I didn't mention that. I answered the door in a cashmere sweater I had owned for years and never worn anywhere Adrian might see. She walked in behind Daniel, and I watched her face as she crossed the threshold and saw the entry hall, saw the floors, saw the built-in bookcase through the living room doorway. She stopped walking for just a second, half a second maybe. Then she recovered. "This is lovely," she said. Her voice was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to be polite, tight enough that I could hear the effort. I gave them the tour. Daniel was openly delighted. He loves beautiful spaces, always has, and he kept stopping to ask questions about where I'd found things and how much the renovation had taken. I answered him honestly. He asked about the freestanding tub, and I told him what it had cost, and he let out a low whistle. Adrian was quiet. She looked at the kitchen and the porch and the master bath and said the right things at the right times. But her eyes were doing calculations I recognized because I do calculations for a living. We sat down in the living room with our coffee. Dorothea stopped by briefly, still in her gardening gloves, and she and I chatted for a few minutes at the front door. When I came back, Adrian was looking at the bookcase with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This must have been quite expensive," she said, not accusatorially, more like she was still processing. "It was a reasonable price for the neighborhood," I said, "but you're retired, right?" She said it carefully, like she was trying to solve something without appearing to try. "I am," I said. "So did you. Did you sell your apartment? Or was there a—" She trailed off. "I had savings," I said simply, and I left it there. I watched something shift in her, a kind of recalibration. The practical June framework she'd been using for 5 years wasn't quite fitting anymore, and she didn't know what to replace it with. Daniel, bless him, started asking about the oak tree in the front yard and whether I was going to get a porch swing, and the conversation moved on. They stayed for about 90 minutes. As they were leaving, Adrian paused at the door. I thought she was going to say something about the house, but instead she said, "We should have you over dinner soon, properly. Not just, we should make time." I said I would like that. She nodded. She looked like someone who had just realized they'd been playing chess without knowing the other person's pieces. I closed the door and stood in my beautiful entry hall and didn't feel triumphant exactly. It wasn't the feeling I'd expected. What I felt was quieter than that, more settled. Like something that had been slightly off balance for years had been gently corrected. Over the following weeks, things changed in small ways. Adrian texted me, something she had never done directly before, always going through Daniel, to ask where I had found my kitchen tile. I sent her the name of the showroom. She asked if I wanted to meet for coffee sometime. I said yes. We met at a place she suggested downtown. She was warmer in a way that wasn't quite comfortable yet, but was trying. She asked me about my work, what I had actually done, what an actuary really was. I explained it. She listened, which was new. She told me about a financial decision she and Daniel were trying to make about refinancing, and I gave her my honest read on the numbers. She said, "I didn't know you knew about that." And I said gently that there was quite a lot she didn't know about me. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "I think I've been unfair to you." She didn't elaborate. I didn't press. But it was something. What I've never told her, what I've never told anyone in that life, is the full picture. She knows now that I had savings, that I could afford the house, that I am not the person she assumed I was. But she doesn't know the exact number. She doesn't know about the brokerage account or the dividend income or what Howard Bellamy sends me a summary of every quarter. I've decided she doesn't need to know. Not because I'm punishing her, not because I'm saving it for some future reveal. I've just realized that the money was never the point. It was never what I wanted her to see. What I wanted was for her to see me, my judgment, my taste, my values, my capacity. To know that I was a person worth taking seriously before she knew a single number. I think she's beginning to, slowly. Daniel came over one evening in November by himself, the way he used to when he was in his 20s, and just wanted to sit in someone's kitchen and talk. He brought a 6-pack of the craft beer he likes, and we sat at my kitchen island and talked for 2 hours about his marriage and how he knew he had let things slide. Let me get pushed to the margins without really pushing back. He was honest about that. He wasn't making excuses for Adrian, but he also wasn't tearing her apart. He just said he should have been paying more attention, and he was sorry. I told him I forgave him without hesitating, because I did. I also told him something I'd been thinking about for a while. I told him that I understood why Adrian had made the assumptions she'd made, because I had never given her any evidence to the contrary. I had played the role she'd assigned me without ever questioning it, and some of that was on me. I had been hiding, in a way, not dishonestly, but hiding nonetheless, and at 53 I was too old to keep doing that. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "When did you get so wise?" I told him I had always been this wise. He just hadn't been looking. He laughed, and I laughed. And the oak tree outside the window was bare now, all its leaves gone, and the streetlights were on. And it was exactly the kind of evening I had been picturing when I signed the purchase agreement on this house. Warmth inside, quiet outside, my son at my kitchen island, no pretense between us. Was there still work to do with Adrian? Yes, there probably always would be. She was who she was. Proud, perceptive, competitive, and I didn't need her to transform completely. I just needed us to be honest. I think we were getting there. But here's the thing I want you to understand. If any of this sounds like a story about money, it's not about the money. The $615,000 house was not a power move, even if the timing had an edge to it. The years of saving and quietly growing my portfolio were never about winning anything. They were about the freedom to make choices without asking permission. The freedom to walk out of a room where someone had just called me, content with basics, and know in my car on the drive home that I was so much more than that. I had built something real and true and entirely my own. And I had done it in the years when no one was watching. The people who judge you by your coat and your car and the brand of cobbler you bring to a party. They always think they're reading you accurately. They almost never are. I pulled into my driveway that November evening after Daniel left, and I sat for a moment before going inside. The oak tree was just a silhouette against the sky. The porch light was on. The house was mine. I thought about Adrian, saying, "I think I've been unfair to you," and how much it had taken for her to say it, and how I hadn't needed her to say it to know it was true. I got out of the car. I went inside. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat by the window, and thought, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be.